So we're back with lesson 3. It's our final part of our lesson. We've been working with views today, but now we're going to go over our database setup. So you do need some software, but I think probably most, if not everybody in the class already has the software that you need. I did put it in the chat before the break. So the two things you need under weekly learning tools and resources, you will need SQL Server. The developer, the version doesn't really matter, even if you have 2017 or you have standard, whatever. But you can get the developer edition from the Azure portal. You can just accept the default options, but you must make sure you install the database engine. That installs the local server on your laptop. You'll also need SQL Server Management Studio, which you can get from this link. Management Studio is kind of like MySQL Workbench, but for SQL Server. I imagine you probably have, most of you probably have this software already from your C# course. In order to get SQL Server from Azure, you also will need to verify yourself as a student. I can put the link in the chat, but you've probably done this already. So if you haven't signed up as a student with Microsoft, you'll want to do this because they give us $100 worth of credits that we can use for hosting our database and web application in this course. So you just put in your student email, fill out the form, they'll send you a verification link. Most of you have probably already done this so that you could download the software. So I'm going to go through the process of setting up a local database. Okay, well, you click Start Free. You'll sign in with your Georgian login. So I can't do it because I'm already signed in. So Gerline, just follow the link I sent you, sign in with your Georgian login. It will ask you some information about what school you're at, and then it will send you an email with a verification link to verify that you are in fact a student. So I'm going to set up a local database, which I'm going to use first for my global grub, and then I'll also show you how to create a database in the Azure portal. So my suggestion is you use two. Use your local server for global grub because it's going to be faster. For your assignment, the database can't run on your local server. It has to run on the Azure portal instead. So let's start with a local SQL Server database first. You probably did this in your C# course, but I will go over the setup again. So the first thing I want to do is I want to make sure that SQL Server is actually running on my machine. So the easiest way to do this is to open up this application, which would get installed when you set up SQL Server. It's called SQL Server Configuration Manager. You probably have 2019. If you have an older version, it's fine. They're all interoperable. So it doesn't matter if you have 2016, 2017, no problem. So I'm going to open up Configuration Manager, and it shows me that I have a local instance of SQL Server that is running. Okay, Mihir, yes, we can look at it. So, and it should, typically it's set to automatic. So SQL Server, the service starts every time I boot my operating system. SQL Server is running. So just make sure it's running. If it's not running, you can just right click it and start it. You can also go to the properties, I think, and set the start mode to be automatic. So during this semester, you probably want SQL Server running whenever you turn your computer on. So now I'm going to open up my Management Studio. So open up Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. And to connect, it should show my local server name here in this connect to server box. If you don't see your server, but Configuration Manager tells you that it's running, you can actually browse for it. So if you click this little drop down on server name, you can click Browse for More. And then under Database Engine, you will see your server. So you can just click on it. There's two ways to authenticate through SQL Server on your local machine. The default option is Windows authentication. So that just lets your Windows account sign in. And that's the default. So I should just be able to connect here. So I'll just click connect. I've got my local server. And then to make a new database, I can just right click and choose new database. I'm going to call it Global Grub without any spaces, same name as my application. And then I can just click the OK button. This will create an empty database on my local server. So I refresh. Yeah, that's fine. I don't care. Just ignore that error. So now I've got a local database I can work with. I'm not going to do anything in the database, but setting it up is as simple as that. Connect to your local server, right-click Databases, New Database, give it a name, OK. So again, I'm only going to use this for the in-class application. You're not going to want to do it this way for your assignment. So now I'm going to show I'm going to also set up a global grub database on Azure. And you can set up a database for your assignment on Azure. So how do we do this? The link to manage everything in Azure is portal.azure.com. I'll put it in the chat. You don't have to set up your assignment database right now. I am recording this, so you're free to do it later. So Azure is this massive ecosystem of cloud services. We're going to use it for hosting our database and web application. There's much more to Azure than this. There is a big data analytics area in here. There's an artificial intelligence area. There's tons and tons of different resources available. We can create virtual machines. We can contain container instances with Kubernetes and Docker, blockchain, analytics, there's an Internet of Things portal. Lots of stuff, media and storage, but we're primarily going to be concerned with web and database here. I'll also mention that we are a Microsoft partner, and Microsoft offers certification exams in Azure, and we have purchased some licenses for students. So there are a number of Microsoft certifications. I'll just may as well mention. So this is the first one, Azure Fundamentals. I actually did this exam last spring. So we have a number of licenses that will actually pay for your exam if you're interested in doing it. So Microsoft offers a bunch of training material here where you can go ahead and study online. So if you're interested in potentially pursuing one of the Microsoft certification exams, reach out to me and I can see if we still have coupon codes for you to write the exams. So this is outside of our curriculum, but we offer it as an add-on. So I'll go back to the Azure homepage. So what I want to do is create a resource. And we should see right here in the list, one of the most popular resources is this SQL database. So I'm going to click on Create. Okay, that's great. So you should have an Azure for Students subscription. Now, because we can create all kinds of resources in Azure, it likes us to group them together for ease. So I'm going to create a new, under resource group. I've got a whole bunch of existing resource groups. I'm going to create a new resource group. I'll just call it, I don't know, Tuesday. Tuesday, fall 21. So here's a resource group for this class. I need to enter a name for my database. So I'm going to call it Global Grub. You might call it, yes, SQL database. You might give it a name. There should be no spaces here for your assignment. Again, you don't have to put your Global Grub database on Azure, but you do have to put your assignment database on Azure. It now wants me to either select an existing server or create a new one. So I'm going to create a new server. And now it's asking me to create a server name and username and password. So I'm going to create these things and then I'm going to put them in a file so I don't forget them because I'm going to need these credentials later to connect my web application. So I'm going to call mine globalgrub.database.windows.net. My login will be, let's see, Tuesday DBA. And I'll just make my password fall 2021. Confirm it. Then it wants a location. I'll pick maybe Canada East. Okay, which it won't let me, so I'll have to leave it as East US, I think. So before I save this, I'm going to make a text file with these credentials because I'm going to need these credentials next week. So I will just make a new text file here. Fall 2021 Azure credentials. And then I'm going to put it in. So my server is globalgrub.database.windows.net. My DB name is Global Grub. My username, I made it Tuesday DBA, and my password is fall. So I'm going to need these credentials next week to connect my web application. So I'm going to keep them in a text file so I remember them. So now I'm going to click OK. And I'm going to set up some of the configuration. I don't need the SQL Elastic Pool. Now, this is overpowered. So right now, it's got 2 cores, 32 gigs of storage. I don't need that. I'm going to click this configure database. I want to scale this down. I'm going to click configure. And you can see that the estimated cost per month. I don't need this. I want the smallest possible. So I don't need this vCore based purchasing model. I want this one, this basic option. So estimated cost. So this will use about $6 a month of the $100 US credit. So it actually uses about $4 a month US of my credit. So pick the basic service tier. We need the lowest performance. I'll click apply. Also under storage, okay, we don't really care about this storage option for now. So I'll just click next. And I can actually just click review and create here. So my estimated cost is $6 a month, but it's going to be paid for with my Azure for Students service. I'll click create. It's going to first create the server, and then once the server is online, it will create a database inside of my server with the username and password that I entered. This will take a minute to do. The portal should update when the deployment is done, and then we can try to connect to it from Management Studio. So I'm going to add this server to my Management Studio portal. Takes a minute to run. So once this is set up, I'll connect through Management Studio, and then we should be done for the day. I can stay in the room and help anybody who's having issues. I just left it as the default, Elizabeth. We don't really need it. We don't need to worry about redundant storage. So we want to be careful managing our resources because we only get $100 US worth of credits to last us through the semester. So it's created my server now. So it's created the server. Now it's actually creating the database inside the server. So it's almost finished. A little longer than I expected. There are also tons of great resources on LinkedIn Learning for working with Microsoft Azure. So we'll work with it regularly. You'll learn some of the features, but there's a lot more. Okay, so my database was created, deployment succeeded. I can say go to my resource now. So here's our database. So now what I'm going to do is use Management Studio. Yes, you're going to use, well, Dhruv, I would recommend, you could create your assignment database right now. You don't have to do it now if you don't want to. You're not going to be able to start using it really until next week. So if you want to wait a week to create assignment 2 until after next week's lesson, that's fine as well. It's not mandatory you do it right now. I am recording this, so you can always watch this next week. So now I'm going to go to Management Studio, and I'm going to try to connect So I'm going to connect to a new database engine. Actually, you know what? I want to try and do it here. Actually, sorry, I'll just do it here. So I'm going to connect the database engine. So now I need to put in the credentials that I added to Azure. So my server is global grub database windows.net. Windows authentication doesn't work for Azure. So I need to change this from Windows to SQL Server authentication. And now I need to enter the username and password that I just set up in the Azure portal. And I'll click Remember Password. So I created this server and this username password combination in the Azure portal. I'm now going to try to connect to it. So I'll click Connect. And it says, your client IP does not have access. Sign into Azure and create a new firewall rule to enable access. What does this mean? So my credentials are right, but it says that my IP doesn't have access. How come, do you suppose this is? Right, by default, Azure blocks remote connections to SQL Server for security. So to fix this, Notice here in the Azure portal, I've got this link right in the middle. The fourth item in the nav bar says set server firewall. So I've got a couple options. I can just whitelist my IP, that will work. Or I could set a rule. I think I'm going to do this instead. I'm going to set a rule to allow any IP addresses in so long as they have the right username and password. So this way, if I am at my girlfriend's house working, or I have to go into my office at the college, I still have access. Or if my ISP changes my IP address. So I could click Add Client IP, but instead I'm going to go down to this rule section. I'll just put in a rule called all. And my start IP will be 0.0.0.0. Now I want you, well, Scott, it is, but for our purposes, we're okay. And I want you to add a rule because I may need to look in your database when I'm marking your assignment, right? I may have to run it locally. I may need to look in, and if you only add your own IP, I don't have access to it. So the end IP should be 255.255.255.255. So the name, I just called it all, but the name doesn't matter. But starting at 0.0.0.0 and ending in all 255s. And then I will just click on the save button up here to save this rule. Once I click save and update the firewall, I can then go back to Management Studio and I can try to connect again. So I'll click save. Azure is going to update the firewall. It happens pretty much right away. I can now see my rule gets added here that I could delete or change. So I'm going to click cancel here. And now I'm just going to try to connect again. And bang, now I'm connected. So now I have two versions of this database, my local version and the Azure version. Both databases are empty. We'll build out the tables next week in class. You notice that the Azure version, it's slower. And if I go to, let's say, refresh my table, look, locally, the table list opens pretty much right away. But on Azure, there's a bit of latency. It's not quite as fast. So in class, it will be faster to use a local database. For your assignment, you'll need to set it up and use Azure. But again, keep in mind, you will need to, so I can close this, you will need to set a firewall rule in order to connect from your laptop to the remote database on Azure. Okay, so I know we had a question earlier, I think from Attila, about connecting remote, or Mar about connecting remotely. Right? So if we open up the firewall rule, we can do that remote connection. Sorry, Manjinder, I don't understand the. Well, your server name will be here, whatever you called it. It'll show up right here. So you'll need to use that when you're connecting and then enter the username and password. So this is why I recommend putting those values in a text file so you have access to them, because we're also going to need these values next week. We want to add the credentials into our web project. Into the app settings.json file, we'll want the credentials to go here so we can connect to it. Okay, so we're not going to do that today. We just wanted to set the database up, and you could see the process both of doing it locally as well as setting up the database in the Azure portal. So what we will do next week is actually plan out and build out our data model. We'll create the model classes in Visual Studio. We'll add the connection string, and we'll get our application working. Okay, Alex, when you create the server, it automatically gives you this suffix, database.windows.net, but the first item is asking you to give it a prefix, so you define it here. Scott, that's odd. Mine was 649. Just make sure you pick the basic option. You may have also picked a different region, Scott. Different regions are priced differently. So I picked East US. You may have picked a different geographic region. The pricing is not necessarily the same. Okay, so I have recorded this, so if you're doing it later or you have an issue, you can also always go back over the recording. So your checklist for this week. Make sure you complete the week 3 quiz. It'll be available in the week 4 folder at 2 o'clock until 5 o'clock next Monday. We've scaffolded a create form. Make sure you contribute to the PowerPoint slide deck if you haven't already. Make sure you've got a local database set up, and you can start planning out your models for assignment 2. Okay, so that's it for this week. So next week next week is a critical class. Make sure you're here, because we're going to connect the web project to the database and scaffold out controllers and views and look at how do we generate data models, relate them, build our tables. Really lots of important stuff next week. Okay. If you've got everything working, you have no questions, you're free to go. I will stay in the room, and if anybody needs help, I will do that. Okay. Have a great week, everybody. Thanks for your contributions and participation and attention today. See you next week.